The chandelier above the mahogany dining table glinted, a silent observer to what my parents, Eleanor and Richard, called their annual celebration of family success. Crystal glasses chimed, expensive wine flowed, and the conversation hummed with that familiar mix of gossip and one-upmanship. I sat somewhere in the middle, pushing salmon around my plate, as my cousin Daniel proudly recounted his recent promotion to senior vice president. At the head of the table, Richard stood, raising his glass. I knew what was coming, another speech about achievement, about legacy. He lived for these moments, the attention, the role of patriarch to our sprawling family. His silver hair caught the light as he cleared his throat, instantly silencing the room. Another year has passed, he began, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he'd honed over decades in corporate law. Another year where we celebrate what this family has accomplished together. I took a sip of water, already feeling the familiar knot in my stomach tighten. These speeches never ended well for me. Some of us have truly embraced what it means to be successful, he continued, gesturing toward my sister, Khloe, who sat across from me, her perfectly manicured hand resting on her husband Mark's arm. Khloe and Mark have shown us what real ambition looks like. Their new Riverbend estate is a testament to hard work and smart decisions. Khloe offered a graceful smile, her head tilting in practiced modesty. Her diamond earrings probably cost more than my monthly salary. Mark squeezed her hand, his expression as smug as ever. 6 bedrooms, private dock, panoramic views of Lake Michigan, Richard went on, warming to his subject. Now that's the kind of achievement we should all aspire to. I felt my Aunt Susan's eyes flick toward me, briefly, before she looked away. She knew what was coming. We all did. Richard's gaze finally landed on me, and his smile sharpened. Then we have others among us who seem content with different choices. The table grew quieter. My cousin Hannah paused mid-sentence with Uncle Robert. My youngest daughter, he said, gesturing with his wine glass, has chosen a path of comfortable mediocrity. Living in a rental apartment at 32 years old, working at a non-profit that barely keeps the lights on. A familiar heat crept up my neck, but I kept my expression neutral. I'd learned years ago not to react to his provocations. Tell me, he addressed me directly now, his voice dripping with theatrical concern, when do you think you'll actually own property? When will you ever have a Riverbend estate like your sister? Laughter rippled around the table. Not genuine amusement, but the nervous, obligatory kind people offer when someone in power makes a joke at another's expense. My Uncle Michael chuckled dutifully. My cousin Sarah covered her mouth, her eyes darting between Richard and me. Khloe's smile widened. She lived for these moments. Had always enjoyed watching Richard elevate her at my expense. Since childhood, she'd been the golden child, while I'd been the perpetual disappointment. Maybe by the time you're 50, Richard continued, encouraged by the response. Or perhaps you'll just spend your whole life paying someone else's mortgage while your sister enjoys sunset views from her private terrace. More laughter. Eleanor touched Richard's arm gently, a gesture that might have looked like an attempt to rein him in, but I'd seen her make that same motion 100 times. It was for show, nothing more. She never actually stopped him. I sat my fork down carefully, the silver clinking softly against the porcelain plate. The sound seemed unusually loud in that moment, drawing several pairs of eyes toward me. Actually, I said quietly, my voice cutting through the dying laughter, I should probably clarify something about Khloe's Riverbend estate. Khloe's smile faltered, just a flicker, barely noticeable unless you'd spent a lifetime learning to read her expressions. What's there to clarify? Richard asked, his tone dismissive. We've all seen the house. It's magnificent. Oh, it's magnificent, I agreed, meeting his gaze steadily. But it's not exactly Khloe's house, or Mark's. The laughter stopped completely. Mark straightened in his chair, his jaw tightening. Khloe's hand moved from his arm to her wineglass, gripping the stem with a bit too much pressure. What are you talking about? Richard asked, his expression shifting from amused condescension to confusion. I could have stopped there. Could have backed down, laughed it off, pretended I'd been making a joke. That's what the old me would have done. The version of myself that had spent decades trying to avoid confrontation with my family. But 3 weeks ago, I'd received a phone call that changed everything, and I was done being the family punching bag. The Riverbend estate belongs to the bank, I said clearly, letting each word land with precision. Khloe and Mark are 4 months behind on their mortgage payments. They received a foreclosure notice last Tuesday. The silence that fell over the table was absolute. Someone's fork clattered against their plate. Aunt Susan inhaled sharply. Richard's face went through a rapid series of expressions: disbelief, confusion, then anger. That's ridiculous. Where would you even get such an absurd idea? From the bank, I replied calmly. Specifically from Riverbend Savings Bank, where I happen to sit on the board of directors. That revelation landed like a second bomb. My cousin Daniel's mouth actually fell open. Uncle Robert set down his wineglass with a thud. "You're on a bank board?" Eleanor asked, her voice faint with shock. "For the past 18 months," I confirmed. The nonprofit I work for, Heartland Community Initiatives, partnered with Riverbend Savings to create affordable housing initiatives. They were impressed enough with my work to offer me a board position. It's volunteer, but it comes with access to certain information, especially regarding properties in default within the community development zones we oversee. Khloe had gone pale, her perfectly applied makeup suddenly looking garish against her blanched skin. Mark stared at his plate as if he wished he could disappear into it. The Riverbend estate, I continued, my voice still quiet but carrying easily in the stunned silence, falls within one of our oversight zones because Mark claimed it as a primary residence for tax purposes while renting out their actual home in the city. That made it reportable to our committee when the default notices started piling up. Richard turned to Khloe, his expression demanding an explanation. "Is this true?" Chloe's mouth opened, but no sound came out initially. Finally, she managed a weak, "It's more complicated than that." "It's actually not complicated at all," I said. "You bought a house you couldn't afford, using a mortgage that was stretched even when Mark had his previous job. When his company downsized and cut his salary by 40% 8 months ago, you couldn't keep up with the payments. But rather than downsize or ask for help, you kept up appearances, kept throwing parties, kept posting vacation photos on social media. You had no right to look into our private financial matters," Mark finally spoke up, his voice tight with anger and humiliation. "I didn't look into anything," I corrected him. "Your account came across my desk during a routine review of properties in default within our development zones. I'm legally obligated to review those files. I actually recused myself from any decision-making regarding your specific case, precisely because of the family connection." Richard had sunk back into his chair, the wind completely gone from his sails. He looked older, suddenly diminished. Around the table, family members exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure where to look or what to say. "But here's the interesting part," I continued, and I could hear the edge creeping into my voice. Years of swallowed anger, of endured humiliation, of being dismissed and belittled, all of it rising to the surface. While reviewing the file, I noticed something else. Khloe and Mark have been using photos of the Riverbend estate to promote Mark's investment consulting business, claiming it as his office and suggesting a level of success that would attract high-net-worth clients. Except Mark isn't licensed as an investment consultant. He's been taking money from friends and family members, promising returns, and basically running what looks an awful lot like a small-scale investment scheme. That final revelation shattered whatever remained of the dinner party atmosphere. Uncle Robert stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "He took $20,000 from me last year," Robert said, his voice shaking. "Promised me 15% returns. He got $30,000 from Mom and me," Aunt Susan added, her face flushed. "Said it was a guaranteed investment in emerging technologies." Mark tried to stand, perhaps to leave or defend himself, but my cousin Daniel's hand shot out, pressing down on his shoulder. "You took $45,000 from my retirement fund," Daniel said, his voice dangerously quiet. You said it was going into a diversified portfolio managed by your firm. This is insane. Khloe burst out, finally finding her voice. You're all listening to her. She's jealous. She's always been jealous of what Mark and I have built together. You haven't built anything, I said, my calm tone contrasting sharply with her rising hysteria. You've built a house of cards using other people's money. And what's worse, you've been parading around acting superior, letting Dad use your fake success as a weapon against me, all while knowing it was complete fiction. Richard stood up slowly, bracing himself against the table. He looked at Khloe with an expression I'd never seen him direct at her before. Disappointment mixed with something like betrayal. How much? He asked. How much did you take from me? Khloe's eyes filled with tears, her carefully constructed facade crumbling. Daddy, we were going to pay everyone back. Mark has deals in the works, and once they close, how much? Richard repeated, his voice harder. Mark answered, his voice barely above a whisper. $80,000. Last year for the house down payment and renovations. Eleanor made a small sound of distress. Richard closed his eyes briefly, his jaw working as he processed this information. There's no investment account, is there? Richard asked, though it wasn't really a question. No offshore opportunities, no emerging tech startup acquisitions, none of it. Mark shook his head mutely. The dinner party disintegrated after that. Uncle Robert threatened legal action. Aunt Susan cried. My cousins formed small clusters, comparing notes on how much money Mark had taken from various family members. The total, from what I could overhear, exceeded $200,000. Khloe tried to leave with Mark, but Richard's voice stopped her at the doorway. Stay, he commanded. You owe everyone here an explanation. What followed was a 2-hour reckoning. Mark admitted he'd lost his job completely 6 months ago, not just taken a pay cut. The consulting business had been a desperate attempt to make quick money and keep up appearances. He'd taken funds from nearly a dozen family members, always promising impressive returns, always claiming he had insider access to lucrative opportunities. Khloe had known about the lost job and the precarious financial situation, but she claimed ignorance about the extent of Mark's scheme. From the way she couldn't meet anyone's eyes, I doubted that was entirely true. She'd been too willing to accept the money flowing in, too eager to maintain their lifestyle to be completely unaware. Richard sat in silence through most of the confessions, his expression unreadable. When Mark finally finished his halting explanation, Richard turned to me. Why didn't you say something sooner? He asked. If you knew they were in trouble, why wait until tonight? It was a fair question, and I'd anticipated it. I only received the complete file 3 weeks ago, I explained. I spent that time trying to figure out how to handle it. I actually debated whether to say anything at all or just let the foreclosure process play out naturally. What changed? Eleanor asked softly. I looked at Richard directly. Tonight changed it. Listening to you mock my life choices, using Khloe's supposed success as proof of my failure. Watching everyone laugh along like my existence was some kind of joke. I realized I was done protecting people who've never protected me. Richard flinched at that. Actually flinched. For just a moment, I saw something like shame cross his features. You could have talked to me privately, Khloe said, her voice small and defeated. You didn't have to humiliate us in front of everyone. The irony of that statement hung in the air. I almost laughed. Like how you and Dad humiliate me at every family gathering? I asked. Like how you spent years posting photos of your perfect life on social media while I struggled with student loan debt from the graduate degree I earned to work in community development? Like how you never once acknowledged that my work actually helps people? That I've helped secure housing for over 300 families in the past 5 years? That I've made a genuine difference in people's lives, even if it didn't come with a riverbend view? Khloe looked away, unable to respond. Aunt Susan approached me as other family members began filtering out, most of them too angry at Mark and Khloe to bother with polite goodbyes. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "Sorry we laughed. Sorry we never stood up for you." I nodded, accepting the apology, but not quite ready to absolve her. "Thank you for saying that." She hesitated, then added, "Your work really does matter." I thought that for years, but never said it out loud. That was wrong of me. After most of the guests had left, only my parents, Khloe, Mark, and I remained in the dining room. The catering staff had cleared the dishes, leaving behind only the lingering smell of extinguished candles and expensive wine. I stood near the doorway, ready to leave, when Eleanor's voice stopped me. "Please don't go yet," she said. "We need to talk about this properly." "There's nothing more to say," I replied, exhaustion creeping into my voice. "Everything that needed to come out has come out." "But we haven't talked about how we move forward from here," Richard said. He'd aged 10 years in the span of a few hours. "We can't just leave things like this." I turned back to face them all. These people who were supposed to be my family but had felt like adversaries for so long. "What exactly do you want to hear from me? That I forgive everyone and we can go back to normal?" There is no normal to go back to. The normal was broken. Khloe stood shakily, gripping the edge of the table for support. "I need to say something," she announced. "Before you leave, before we all scatter and pretend this never happened, I need to say this." Everyone turned toward her. She took a shuddering breath, gathering courage, or perhaps just trying to hold herself together. "I've been jealous of you for years," she said, looking directly at me. "Not in the way you probably think. I wasn't jealous of what you had or didn't have. I was jealous of your freedom." I stared at her, confused. "My freedom?" "You never cared what they thought," she said, gesturing toward Eleanor and Richard. "Or maybe you did care, but you still chose your own path anyway. You pursued work that mattered to you, even when Dad mocked it. You lived in a way that aligned with your values, even when everyone judged you for it. I've spent my entire adult life trying to win approval, trying to be perfect, trying to prove that I deserve to be the favorite." Her voice cracked on that last word. Mark moved beside her, his hand hovering near her back but not quite touching, as if he wasn't sure he had the right to offer comfort. "And the worst part," Khloe continued, tears flowing freely now, "is that even when I was winning, even when Dad praised me and held me up as the example, I felt empty because I knew it was all performance. I knew the house was mortgaged beyond our means. I knew Mark's business was failing. I knew we were drowning. But I couldn't stop performing because the performance was all I had." Richard sank into a chair, his face buried in his hands. Eleanor stood frozen, processing her daughter's confession. "Every time Dad compared you to me," Khloe went on, "I felt this horrible mix of satisfaction and guilt. Satisfaction because I was winning his game. Guilt because I knew the game itself was poisonous. But I couldn't stop playing. I didn't know how to stop." The rawness in her voice reached something in me. Some place that remembered being sisters before we became competitors. Before we became casualties of our parents' misguided priorities. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Khloe said. "I don't deserve that. I just needed you to know that while you thought I was looking down on you, I was actually watching you live authentically and wishing I had your courage." The confession stripped away another layer of pretense, exposing wounds that had been festering for decades. Eleanor was crying now, too. Silent tears streaming down her face as she witnessed the damage she and Richard had caused. "This family has been toxic," I said finally, my voice steady despite the emotion churning inside me. "Not just to me, but to all of us. We've measured worth by bank accounts, validated success through material possessions, and ignored the human cost of those choices. How do we fix it?" Richard asked, his voice muffled. "Tell me how to fix this." "I don't know if you can," I admitted. But you could start by examining why you built your entire identity around money and status. You could start by recognizing that you had two daughters who both needed your approval and love, but you only offered it conditionally to one of us, and that condition was poison for her, too. Richard lifted his head, his eyes red. When I was growing up, he began, his voice rough. My father worked 3 jobs to keep us fed. We wore second-hand clothes, lived in a 2-bedroom apartment with 6 people, never took vacations, never had anything new. I watched my mother cry over bills she couldn't pay. I saw my father's spirit break a little more each year. He paused, collecting himself. I promised myself my children would never know that struggle, that uncertainty. But somewhere along the way, I confused financial security with wealth accumulation, comfort with luxury, stability with status. I made money into a god and demanded you both worship at the same altar. And I enabled it, Eleanor added, finding her voice. Every time you belittled your sister's choices, I stayed silent. Every time you praised Khloe's acquisitions, I nodded along. I told myself I was supporting you, supporting our family values. But really, I was just taking the easy path, avoiding conflict, even when that conflict was desperately needed. Richard looked older than I'd ever seen him. His shoulders slumped, his face drawn. What happens now? He asked, directing the question at no one in particular. The weight of the evening hung heavy in the air. I could see Richard processing everything, trying to reconcile the image he built of Khloe's perfect life with the reality of fraud and foreclosure now staring him in the face. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass. I want to know how this happened, Richard said, his voice rough. How did we get here? Mark, you had a good job, a solid career. How did it all fall apart? Mark looked up, his face haggard. The company started downsizing 2 years ago, he began, his voice barely audible. They kept saying it was temporary, that things would bounce back. I believed them because I wanted to believe them. We'd just bought the house, taken on that massive mortgage, and I convinced myself that my position was secure. You should have told us, Eleanor interjected, her voice tight with emotion. We could have helped you transition, find something else. I was ashamed, Mark admitted. Every time I came to these gatherings, everyone was doing so well. Daniel getting promoted, Robert's investments paying off, everyone moving up and forward. I couldn't admit that I was sliding backward. Khloe's eyes filled with fresh tears. And I made it worse, she said quietly. I kept pushing for the lifestyle we talked about when we got engaged. The nice cars, the prestigious address, the country club membership. I didn't want to give up the image we'd created. Richard stood abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the darkened yard. This is my fault, too, he said, his back to all of us. I created an environment where you felt like failure wasn't an option, where admitting struggle meant losing your place in this family. The admission hung in the air, unprecedented in its honesty. Eleanor moved beside him, her hand finding his shoulder. Do you remember what you said when I told you I was going into non-profit work? I asked, my voice cutting through the moment. You told me I was wasting my education, throwing away opportunities, settling for mediocrity. You actually used that word, mediocrity. Richard turned from the window, his eyes meeting mine. I remember. And when I told you about my board position at the bank, about the housing initiatives I was leading, you asked how much the board seat paid, I continued. When I said it was volunteer work, you dismissed it completely, changed the subject to talk about Khloe's new car. He flinched at the memory. I was wrong. You taught us that worth equals wealth, I pressed on, years of frustration finally finding voice. That success means expensive things and impressive titles. You taught Khloe to value appearance over substance. And you taught me that nothing I accomplished would ever matter unless it came with a hefty price tag. Eleanor stepped forward, her face pale. We failed both of you, she said. In completely different ways, but we failed you both. Khloe wiped at her eyes, mascara streaking down her cheeks. I spent so much time resenting you, she said to me. Every time Dad praised me, I felt a twisted satisfaction that I was the favorite, the successful one. But underneath, I think I knew it was hollow. I just didn't want to admit it. You had chances to be honest, I replied, my tone harder than I intended. Every time I struggled with student loans, every time I talked about budgeting and saving, you could have admitted you were drowning, too. Instead, you posted photos of champagne brunches and vacation destinations while taking money from family members under false pretenses. I know, she whispered. I know. Mark stood, his chair scraping against the floor. I need to make this right, he said, his voice steadier now. I need to face what I've done and start making amends. Not just with the money, but with the lies, the deception, all of it. Mark needs to contact everyone he took money from and arrange repayment plans, I said. He should probably also consult with a lawyer because what he's done could potentially be prosecuted as fraud, depending on how he structured the agreements and what documentation exists. Mark's head jerked up. Prosecuted? You'd send me to prison? I'm not sending you anywhere, I replied. But Uncle Robert and the others have every right to pursue legal action. You took their money under false pretenses. The fact that your family doesn't make it less illegal. Richard rubbed his temples, processing everything. The house will likely be foreclosed unless they can catch up on the back payments and demonstrate ability to continue paying, I said. Riverbend Savings is actually more lenient than most banks. They offer loan modification programs, especially for properties in our development zones. If Mark and Khloe are honest about their situation, there might be options. We'll sell it, Khloe said suddenly, her voice dull. Put it on the market. Pay back what we can from the proceeds. Mark looked at her, seeming surprised, but he didn't argue. Maybe he was relieved to hear her finally speak a truth. Eleanor had been silent throughout most of the evening's drama, her face a careful mask. Now she spoke, her voice tentative. Why didn't you ever tell us about the board position, about your accomplishments? I considered the question. Would you have listened? Would Dad have stopped using Khloe's life as a measuring stick against mine if he'd known I was successful in my own right? She didn't answer, which was answer enough. My rental apartment, I continued, is a choice, not a failure. I could qualify for a mortgage. I've actually been pre-approved for quite a substantial loan, but I choose to rent because it allows me flexibility, lets me save more aggressively, and keeps my living expenses low while I'm focusing on my career and community work. In 2 years, I'll have enough saved for a significant down payment on exactly the kind of property I want. Bought on my own terms, without stretching myself thin to impress people who don't actually care about my well-being. Richard winced at that last part. Good. He should. I think we should go, Mark said quietly to Khloe. She nodded, standing on unsteady legs. They moved toward the door together, a united front in their sheer disgrace. Khloe, I called out before they left. She turned, her eyes red-rimmed and puffy. I meant what I said about the loan modification programs. If you're serious about trying to keep the house, I can put you in touch with the right people at the bank. I won't be involved, obviously, but I can make sure your case gets reviewed fairly. She stared at me for a long moment, seeming to search for ulterior motives in my offer. Finally, she simply said, Why would you help us after everything? Because despite everything, you're still my sister, I said. And because I've spent my career helping people navigate financial difficulties. I'm not going to stop now just because the situation is personal. After they left, the house felt cavernous and empty. My parents stood together near the doorway, looking lost in their own home. I owe you an apology, Richard said finally. The words sounded rusty, unpracticed. He probably hadn't apologized to me in decades. A substantial one. I agreed, not letting him off easy. I've been unfair to you, he continued, the words coming with visible difficulty. I've measured your worth by standards that don't actually measure worth at all. Square footage and luxury cars instead of character and contribution. You made me feel like a failure for years, I said, my voice steady despite the emotion behind it. Every family gathering, every phone call, every holiday, you found ways to remind me that I wasn't measuring up to some arbitrary definition of success that you decided was the only one that mattered. He nodded slowly, accepting the accusation. I think I was living vicariously through Khloe. She seemed to embody everything I thought I valued. Ambition, material success, the appearance of having it all figured out. It was easier to celebrate that than to understand what you were actually doing with your life. My work matters, I said firmly. The families I've helped house, the neighborhoods I've helped revitalize, the systems I've helped change, that matters. It matters more than a riverbend view ever could. I see that now, he said quietly. I should have seen it years ago. Eleanor moved closer to Richard, her hand finding his. She looked at me with tears in her eyes. We're proud of you, she said. I know that's probably hard to believe right now, but we are. I am. I should have said it more often. I should have said it every time your father started comparing you to Khloe. Why didn't you? I asked, the question I'd wanted to ask for years finally emerging. Why did you just stand there while he tore me down? She was quiet for a moment, considering her answer carefully. Because it was easier, she admitted. Easier than confronting him. Easier than disrupting the family dynamic. Easier than acknowledging that maybe our values were misaligned with what actually matters in life. That's not good enough, I said. No, she agreed. It's not. We stood in silence for a while, the weight of years of dysfunction settling around us like dust. Finally, Richard spoke again. What do we do now? He asked. How do we fix this? I don't know if you can fix it, I said, honestly. But you could start by examining why material success matters so much to you that you are willing to destroy your relationship with one daughter in favor of praising the other. You could. Think about what kind of legacy you actually want to leave beyond money and property. He nodded, looking humbled in a way I'd never witnessed before. I gathered my coat and purse, preparing to leave. Richard stopped me with a hand on my arm. Will you come to dinner again? He asked. Just the four of us. No extended family, no performances. Maybe, I said. After some time has passed. After you've both had a chance to think about whether you actually want a real relationship with me, or just want to smooth things over and go back to how they were. I want a real relationship, he said, his voice thick. I want to know who you actually are, not who I assumed you were. Then prove it, I said simply. Show me through actions, not words. I left my parents standing in their grand foyer, surrounded by all the trappings of success that suddenly seemed hollow and meaningless. As I drove home to my rental apartment, I felt lighter than I had in years. The fallout from that dinner party extended far beyond that single night. Mark did end up consulting with a lawyer and, on advice of counsel, began repayment arrangements with everyone he'd taken money from. Several family members considered pressing charges but ultimately decided against it, preferring to recover their money rather than pursue prosecution. Khloe and Mark listed the Riverbend estate and sold it within 6 weeks. The proceeds, after paying off the mortgage and associated fees, left them with about $40,000. They used that money to begin repaying family members on a priority basis, starting with those who'd lost the most. They moved into a modest 3-bedroom house in a decent but unglamorous neighborhood. Khloe got a job as a real estate agent, something she'd been licensed for years ago but never pursued seriously. Mark found work as a financial analyst at a mid-sized firm, taking a hard look at his skills and accepting a position that matched his actual qualifications rather than his inflated self-image. Richard called me 2 weeks after the dinner disaster. He asked if I'd be willing to meet for coffee, just the two of us. I agreed, curious to see if his apology had any substance behind it. We met at a small cafe near my apartment. He arrived first, already seated with 2 coffees when I walked in. I noticed he'd ordered mine the way I liked it, light roast, minimal cream, no sugar. A small detail, but one that suggested he'd been paying more attention than I'd realized. "Thank you for coming," he said as I sat down. "I'm still angry," I told him directly. "I want you to know that this isn't me forgiving and forgetting just because you bought me coffee." "I understand," he said. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just want the chance to do better." We talked for 2 hours. He asked about my work. Really asked, listening to my descriptions of current projects and challenges without comparing them to anything else or jumping in with advice. He asked about my goals, my frustrations, my hopes for the future. For the first time in my adult life, Richard treated me like a person whose thoughts and experiences mattered intrinsically, not as a reflection of his own values or aspirations. "I've been thinking about what you said," he told me near the end of our conversation, about examining why material success matters so much to me. "I think it comes from growing up poor, from watching my parents struggle, from equating financial security with worth and dignity." "That's understandable," I said. "But you took it too far. You made money and property into the only measures of value." "I did," he agreed. "And in doing so, I failed to see that you'd actually achieved something much more meaningful than a big house. You've built a career around helping others achieve security and dignity. You understood the actual value behind financial stability while I got distracted by the symbols. It wasn't a complete redemption. Years of pain don't disappear because of one conversation. But it was a start, a genuine attempt to understand rather than dictate." Eleanor reached out separately, inviting me to lunch. We met at a small bistro, just the two of us, and she apologized for her passivity, for never standing up to Richard, for letting me bear the brunt of his misplaced priorities. "I told myself I was keeping the peace," she said. "But really, I was just taking the easy path, even when it meant watching you get hurt." "I needed you to defend me," I said. "I needed someone in my corner." "I know," she replied. "I failed you. I can't take that back, but I want to do better going forward." Like Richard, she began asking questions about my life, my work, my thoughts on things beyond just surface-level pleasantries. She started actually listening to my answers instead of waiting for her turn to talk about Khloe's latest accomplishment. Khloe and I had our own reckoning about 3 months after the dinner party. She called me, asking if we could meet. I was hesitant but agreed. We met at a park halfway between our places. She looked different than she had at the dinner party, less polished, more genuine somehow. The designer clothes had been replaced with jeans and a simple sweater. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail rather than professionally styled. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began. "About how we've paraded around acting superior while everything was falling apart." "It was the truth," I said, not backing down. "It was," she agreed, "and it was humiliating to hear, but I needed to hear it." We both did. She told me about their new life, about how much lighter she felt without the pressure of maintaining appearances. She talked about actually enjoying her real estate job, about finding satisfaction in helping first-time home buyers find places they could actually afford, rather than selling million-dollar properties to people trying to impress others. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "For years of looking down on you, for participating in Dad's comparisons, for benefiting from a dynamic that hurt you. I'm sorry for all of it." I believed her. Her apology had a ring of genuine remorse rather than social obligation. "I'm sorry, too," I said, surprising myself, for the way I revealed everything at dinner. I could have found a more private way to address it. "No," she said, shaking her head. "You couldn't have. We wouldn't have listened to anything said privately. We'd have made excuses, minimized the situation, and continued on the same path." The public revelation was humiliating, but it was also the only thing that could have broken through our denial. We didn't become close after that conversation. The damage was too extensive, the history too fraught. But we established a tentative peace, a willingness to rebuild something healthier than what we had before. The extended family's dynamics shifted dramatically. Uncle Robert and several others stopped attending the annual parties altogether, too angry about the financial losses to want to maintain pretenses. Others, like Aunt Susan, began questioning the competitive, status-focused culture that had enabled Khloe and Mark's deceptions. My cousin Daniel actually thanked me a few months later. "You holding up a mirror to this family's dysfunction was uncomfortable," he said, "but necessary. We've all been so focused on appearances that we stopped caring about substance." Richard's annual party the following year was a much smaller affair. Only immediate family attended, and the tone was markedly different. No speeches about achievement and success. No comparisons or competitions. Just a simple dinner where people talked about their lives honestly rather than performing for each other. During that dinner, Richard raised his glass for a toast. I braced myself. Old habits die hard. "I want to recognize someone who's been doing extraordinary work," he began. "My daughter has spent the past year helping to launch a new initiative that's provided affordable housing to over 80 families in our region. She's testified before the state legislature about housing policy. She's been recognized by the governor's office for her contributions to community development." He looked directly at me. "I should have celebrated this years ago. I should have recognized that helping people build stable lives is worth more than any mansion could ever be." The table was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence rather than an awkward one. Eleanor smiled at me, her eyes glistening. Khloe nodded in acknowledgement. "So, here's to real success," Richard continued. "Not the kind that's measured in square footage or luxury cars, but the kind that's measured in lives changed and communities strengthened." Everyone raised their glasses. It was a small moment, not a dramatic transformation or complete vindication, but it mattered. Later that evening, as I prepared to leave, Richard walked me to my car. "I've been meeting with a therapist," he told me. "Trying to understand why I tied so much of my identity and self-worth to material success." "That's good," I said genuinely. "That's really good. I'm learning that I've been carrying a lot of shame from my childhood," he continued. "Shame about being poor, about not having the things other kids had, about feeling like I didn't matter because my family didn't have money. I spent my whole adult life trying to prove I'd escape that. But in doing so, I passed on a warped set of values to my children." "I appreciate you telling me that," I said. "And I appreciate you working on it." He hugged me before I got in my car. A real embrace rather than the perfunctory side hugs we'd exchanged for years. "I'm proud of you," he said. "I should have said that 1,000 times before now, but I'm saying it now. I'm proud of the person you are and the work you do." Those words, coming from him, meant more than I would have expected. They didn't erase the years of pain, but they offered hope for something better going forward. As I drove home that night, I thought about the journey from that disastrous dinner party to this tentative new beginning. The revelation had been brutal, the fallout painful, but ultimately necessary. Sometimes the only way to heal a broken system is to expose the rot at its core, no matter how uncomfortable that exposure might be. My rental apartment waited for me, modest and unimpressive by my family's old standards, but perfect for my needs. In another year, I'd have the down payment I've been saving for. I'd buy a house on my own terms, with money I'd earned through work that actually mattered, without needing to impress anyone or prove anything to people who'd spent years dismissing my worth. That Riverbend estate had represented everything my family valued: status, appearances, the illusion of success. Its collapse had forced everyone to confront what really mattered beneath the surface. In the end, the most valuable thing to come from that whole mess wasn't property or money or vindication. It was the possibility of honest relationships built on genuine respect rather than performance and pretense. Have you ever had to choose between maintaining peace and speaking a difficult truth to someone you love?